Hi everyone! So today we're going to be talking about a topic called localization. Recently, one of the projects that I was in charge of was localization, and this is a topic that you would need to touch on when you're serving a global audience. So, for example, if you're a company that's starting out right now and you want to reach clients in different parts of the world, then you would need to figure out how can you serve their business in the context of their culture, their language, without really changing your code base too much. So that's where you start thinking of how do you localize, and what are the things that you can do as a designer to help with that. Localization is vital because it enhances your business's potential for growth. So again, like I said, you may want to grow not just within the region of your own country, but also in different parts of the world. However, you would need to identify like what are the cultural norms associated, what are the do's and don'ts, what are the color schemes that people particularly like. Sometimes they associate certain colors, numbers, auspicious times, for example, and things that you normally wouldn't consider is bad, but for certain cultures it is bad. So you need to take into account those things. When you launch a new product in a new market, especially a global market, you also need to understand like what are the nuances in design that you may also have to consider. So there are differences, for example, in the way that a design is displayed on, let's say, Japan, China versus Europe, or let's say North America, where it's particularly English speaking. And so you need to nail these factors. And one way to do that is to ensure that you are taking into consideration how you'll eventually localize in the future. Companies that have successfully localized, like Netflix and Airbnb, have enjoyed a lot of global growth. And it would be a good idea for other SaaS companies that do not have that barrier of like reaching everyone to do the same thing. So, for example, there's Shopify, you can now access them almost everywhere. There's also like payment gateways. So figuring out a way to present your services and making them available for everyone, but also understanding like what are the needs of those people in those markets and serving them without, again, like I said, changing your code base too much is key here. But as designers, we do have a role to play, and there are tools available that make it a lot easier. So one of those tools that I'm going to talk about are like translation apps or translation management systems. And these are applications that people can, deploy in their own apps, and then you could have projects of translating different parts of the app. One thing that people think is easy to do is to just like automatically translate via AI. Sometimes this is effective, but there are nuances that are not translated as well if you rely on this kind of solution. So there still needs to be a person that looks through the translated phrase. Also, the phrase being translated might be lost in context if you just translate word per word. So it's better to look at the entire phrase than it is to just look at one word at a time. If I translate the word open in the context of like, you're opening a door, then that is one way of like thinking of open, having that like, or opening a file, for example. That's one way of one meaning of open. But then if you use open in the context of like opening new business opportunities, or like, let's say, opening your eyes to the reality of the situation. So those are two particular sentences that you may not necessarily see in an app, but it's a different context altogether. So that's why we need to be particular about when we translate certain phrases. When I was conducting UX design research for localization, I was able to find a lot of presentations. There were also like a lot of articles written about it. And one of the themes that I noticed was that when you're designing, let's say in Figma, and also for people in your company in the product team, make sure that when you're tackling a localization project, that all of your entire app, or at least the part that needs to be localized, needs to be responsive. And you also need to test around like how will it look when your text is resizing. So for example, in the English language, certain words for might just take like a few spaces, and then that reduces itself to a little bit more depending on the language that you use afterwards, like Mandarin or Japanese, for example. But then there are certain languages that are very long. I don't know which one's the language that has the longest words, but I know that Germany has like very long words because like they have like words for almost everything. That's what I heard. So German in particular. And so you want to make sure that when you're in Figma, you're testing that out. So you're testing your designs to see how will they respond once they have different languages. It's better if you have the translated language so you know what it looks like, but there are plugins that you can use which replaces the text inside the actual Figma file. So that's one way of doing it. Other things that you need to pay attention to are currency. So currencies are shown differently. So some places will use like commas instead of points, and so there's also like numbers. Like the currency symbol itself is different, so that also needs to be taken into account. Date and time format. There's that. There's also the context again of like you're translating word per word. It's not like you need to translate the entire phrase and not just the word. When you have images, for example, you need to figure out if that image is culturally acceptable to another image. Although take note, so this is a segue to another topic that I recently was watching, and that is like localization for games or like something around culture. So the problem with this is like when you have a culture-based game or a culture-based setting and you want to make it adapt to another person's culture and make it more presentable to them in such a way. One of the more famous ones that do this all the time is Disney. So if you watch certain shows from Disney, you would maybe notice that it looks slightly different depending on where you're watching it from, just so that it is more culture fit for each country that, let's say, a movie or a show is being presented to. And there's a good reason for that. But I was watching Asmongold, and he said that he doesn't agree that there are for me as well, I kind of agree with his points in the sense that you want to hold on to the escapism of a certain, let's say, world in a game. And if I was using something like a currency in the game, and it's a currency called Zenny or gold or whatever, I still want it to be called whatever it is that it's being called. I don't need it to be translated, and I don't need them to change the culture of the game just because it's more culturally fit for me. Let's say if I was living in one part of the country versus another. So I think in these cases where you're launching something, then it may be a good idea to think about like what are the trade-offs that you're making, and is it worth it that you are sort of changing the aspects of an experience to suit the norms and the needs of, let's say, a country that you're trying to serve that to. So in that sense, a game makes sense, but if it's something like a service, for example, let's say you're a mobile phone service. So this is like something that I recently was reading on LinkedIn, and there's these concepts of like lucky numbers. So these are things that people like to see, and then you see that, I think, in Thailand. I'm not sure if they also use that in China, but like they're very auspicious numbers that you want to use on your phone or there's also like bad luck numbers. So I've seen that here in Toronto and Vancouver that there are certain numbers of, let's say, a building, so floor numbers that you do not see, that you only see that you should, it's like it should be 1 2 3 4 5 6 7, but then sometimes you don't see certain numbers because it's a bad luck to have them. Well, anyway, going back to my point, so there are certain things that you need to be mindful of when you're presenting that in your design, and I don't think it takes too long to actually learn that, but that's when you bring an expert along. Because like for myself, I have worked in multiple places like the Philippines, in Dubai, and here in Canada, so I have the cultural nuance of each of these countries because I've lived and worked and I know what the people here want. But I can't really tell what are the needs of people who live in, let's say, Japan, because I'm not Japanese. And it would be better if I was either able to do my research about it, or if there's a designer from Japan that is actually helping me do that kind of have not a designer, but at least someone that knows like what do the Japanese people want. Aside from these things, you also have to be particular about the laws and regulations in place. So right now, I'm very mindful about accessibility, and this is especially true if you're the type of company that deals with government entities. So I know that there are laws that are coming into play, and if you're working in the EU, for example, it might make sense to ensure that your designs are accessible from the start too. There's also data regulation laws. So how do you collect data from each part of the world is very important. In some areas it's okay, in some places it's not okay. Cookies as well. That's why every time you go to a website now, they usually have the cookie policy. Before there was no such thing. So even though you may have a very good localized design, it doesn't really matter until you ship it or test it at first. So make sure that you iterate on the concepts and figure out like what that market needs. And again, if you have an expert or someone that can help you around that market, even better. One company that's very good at localization is McDonald's. And I've had McDonald's in multiple different countries. And one thing that I really love is the experience of just being able to have the same thing all the time and have, generally the same experience everywhere I go. I think that's the key to franchising. Essentially, it's like being able to serve the exact same experience, but with a twist. So in the Philippines, we have chicken with spaghetti in McDonald's. And I think for some time they were also offering Coke floats. So it's like you combine ice cream with Coke. I don't know, but it was a thing back then. And there's also like chicken with rice fillets. I remember that. So I don't have that here in Canada. In Canada, we have poutine, and we also, we have like apple slices and the occasional other fruit slices. So that's pretty interesting. In Dubai, I can't remember what's different from the menu, but I think they had yellow rice, or I could be mistaken. It could be something else. But essentially, they didn't have the same menu, and you can expect something different from each sort of McDonald's that you visit in the world, which is pretty cool. And it just goes to show that they care about the local tastes and what people want from that particular culture. Alright, so this is pretty short and sweet. I hope this is helpful for you, and if you have any questions around localization and or the best tools that you can use for your team, let me know and I'll be happy to answer them. If you like this video, please consider subscribing, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!